Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the presentation by Barb McFarlane, and Joe Hook. And the presentation title has changed slightly. It's Educators as Learners, Building Capacity for Sustainable Pedagogy. And Joe and Barb join us from Monash University. Thank you. And so the presentation today will go for about 20 minutes, followed by about 10 minutes for questions. But in the meantime, if you do have any questions, please post them in the chat tool on the side, and I will be gathering them together and posing them to Barb and Joe at the end. Thanks very much, and over to you.
Thanks, Katrina. I'm just going to put my presentation into presentation mode, which means I lose the view of the screen. I can't see what's going on, so please just yell out if you need me to do anything. So thank you for coming to our presentation. Firstly, we wish to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people on whose land we are presenting from today. We wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here tonight. We are Joe Hook and Barb McFarlane. We're educational designers at Monash University in Melbourne, with leadership responsibilities for education transformation in the faculties of arts and science, respectively. In our presentation, we will outline some of the pedagogic work we have undertaken by sharing 2 case studies with you, and then reflect on the challenges and failures of this work. Despite our expertise and our best efforts, we have found that our pedagogic model for holistic unit design has not had universal uptake, and we have done a bit of soul searching to examine why that is. So we'll come back to our big questions, but first just a bit of a summary of our people. Monash is a large research-intensive university. The science and arts faculties are complex and diverse, with over 300 educators in each, teaching across multiple schools, departments and programs. Each disciplinary area has its own culture and preferred teaching methodology. Through our university network of faculty-based education designers, which you can see from the figures here is growing, Barb and I came to recognise we had similar challenges and shared a similar cultural change philosophy. We meet regularly to share our expertise and problem solve together. Before we start on our big question of uneven engagement, we'd like to ask you to add some words to this Poll Everywhere word cloud to describe your own experience of education change. You can see the poll and the response instructions on the screen, but I'm just going to flip back to the canopy, and I'll just put that in the chat as well, so that people can just click on that link to the Poll Everywhere. What we'll do is come back to this Poll Everywhere at the end of the session, so that we can look at the results and kick off our question time. But while you're having a think about that and getting into the Poll Everywhere, I'll hand over to Barb, who's going to explain in a bit more detail our pedagogic model, and then we'll share our case studies with you before returning to the big questions.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. So this is our pedagogic model. It's very simple. It's a little bit of consistency in the weekly delivery that we ask our educators to engage in. And it consists of using a topic format with a brief description of what the students can expect to read about in the coming week. And I asked that educators change from just writing week 1, week 2, week 3, as they usually did, but to put a title for each week to help lighten the cognitive load for the students as they started to engage in each week's learning. And this was consistent with a semester-long learning pathway where each topic built and constructed more learning and understanding as they moved through in this consistent model. We aim to create a context for learning and developing this pathway over the course of the semester, because we wanted academics to think about creating learning opportunities so that the students can construct their own knowledge and understanding that can be applied across different contexts and different assessment tasks, where they really represent how well they've understood what's been going on. The constructive alignment is really important in this. I find that academics do not use the language constructive alignment and very rarely look at their learning outcomes and map them against their assessment tasks. I had an academic in one of the schools tell me that he thought learning outcomes were merely advisory, and I was quite shocked by that, but nevertheless we carried on. So we'll move on now to the case study, and I'll talk about a big project that I had in the School of Earth, Atmosphere and Environment, where I was approached by the educators to help them review the first and second semester units. And that's how simple it sounded at first. We had a bit of a discussion around it. So I organised a meeting, and I had everyone who was teaching into the first and second year units of this first year unit in Earth, Atmosphere and Environment. And we started talking about the rationale, why it was important. The main reason they wanted to do this was because numbers were dropping off in second and third year, and they felt that what they were teaching in first year wasn't really fitting in with what the school was teaching and promoting, and things had changed and shifted and so on. And then we looked at the pressure points, and there are quite a few pressure points, and people were very vocal and had very strong opinions about what was going wrong, what was right and what was wrong. And, you know, we discussed a whole lot of things, and it got quite intense. And unfortunately, by the end of that first meeting, where everyone said their say about what was wrong with the first and second semester units, someone ended up in tears. So let's look at the next slide. Thanks, Joe. So we didn't want that to happen again, and so I moved the meetings out of the conference room in the school into a workshop, and I planned something very active instead. I took butcher's paper, and as you can see, post-it notes and bits of A4 with their learning outcomes written on them. But before I started with the activities, I flashed their learning outcomes for the first unit in the first semester up onto the board, and they all stopped talking and they looked at them and said, the first thing they said was, where did you get those? And I said, well, they're from your unit guide. And one of them said in this big booming voice, well, that's not what we teach, which was a bit shocking, but also a really good lead into the next activity, which was to then examine our learning outcomes. And I started by asking them, what do they really want the students to know? What is it you really want them to finish understanding and knowing at the end of the semester? And as you can see, they wrote the skills down on bits of post-it notes and tried to map them onto the learning outcomes. I had all the learning outcomes up on the board. But there are a lot of the skills that did not map to the learning outcomes. So we started the process of rewriting the learning outcomes, and we had until the School Board of Studies meeting in April the following year, April 2019. So we had a long time, and we did this in Google Docs, and eventually wrote learning outcomes that everyone felt that they were happy. Could I have the next slide, please, Joe? After that, after we had had our learning outcomes meeting, we met every 2 weeks throughout semester one, leading up to SBOS, leading up to rewriting, and we thrashed out all sorts of ideas about content and assessment. We determined that there would be no exam. We determined that we wanted to introduce reflection as part of that learning process. We changed everything. And there was a lot of discussion from everyone who had very strong opinions and very strong feelings. But we spent a lot of time on the order of the topics and who was going to teach all of this. It's every detail. Nothing was too small. Every 2 weeks we met. By the end of that 2 weeks, we had had enough workshops and discussion. We'd had upskilling workshops. We'd had a really wonderful assessment workshop, a 3-hour assessment workshop where we talked through all of the assessment ideas we had and reached agreement. At the end of that first semester in 2019, the group that was so contentious at that first meeting at the end of 2018, had moved into being a very cohesive team of people who all had the same vision for first year that they had hoped would happen. They were all, to say, they were all on the same page. They were all in agreement, but they'd had 6, 8, 10 months of hard-won work and hard-won results. And they had time to learn what they were doing and time to all come on board and learn skills and become more comfortable with what they were doing. And then we rolled out the unit in 2020. And 2020 was not as we said, but as we expected. But it went all right anyway. I'm going to stop here now and hand over to Jo, who's going to talk about arts.
Thanks, Art. So the example I want to talk about in arts is the implementation of a faculty level LMS template, which we started in 2016, which comprised 2 main elements. The first is the navigation banner across all our sites. I think we've got anywhere between 600 and 1,000 units that we teach over a 2 or 3 year period. So the navigation banner organised these sites into sections, what was previously a vanilla Moodle instance with no design in it. And the second element of the template were subheadings underneath each of these sections to guide our educators to organise their material in a clear and consistent way. With the weekly sections, which are the examples I have up on the screen there, with subheadings in those sections to provide a logical learning pathway for students through what we were promoting to be rich pre-class resources and activities. We did this based on student feedback that their LMS sites were a mess, that was their words. Faculty-wide LMS site audits that confirmed what we already knew, that the LMS was largely used as a repository for PDF files of lecture slides and readings, with very little development of the space as an active learning environment. We drew on learning theory, blended learning methodology and instructional design principles, as well as the university's accessibility requirements. And we had conversations within our education design community of practice. We were able to roll this out across the faculty as it was mandated by the Dean and the Education Executive. It was messaged in terms of student learning experience, student feedback, student surveys, the regular Moodle site reviews we were undertaking in our team to identify any opportunities for enhancement. And it was supported by a suite of pedagogical resources such as how-tos, exemplars, style guides, workshops, showcases and one-on-one support. The result after 1 or 2 semesters was good overall. However, our faculty-wide LMS reviews revealed that there remained widespread use of LMS sites as a repository for learning materials. Despite all the resources we had supplied to support the rollout of the template, many educators had not engaged with the process meaningfully. Our review documentation was shared with all the schools across the faculty, and a common question that came back to us for clarification was, what's a learning pathway? And I chose this picture because it reminded me of me looking over the Moodle sites and getting that feedback. Furthermore, our more reluctant educators were bending the template to match their old practices. Some educators rushed in to adopt innovations, such as using available technologies that plug into our LMS without really understanding how they worked. When they were poorly executed, that resulted in poor student evaluations. And when these evaluations were escalated to the faculty's education executive, some of the educators blamed us, the education designers, for not implementing the innovations correctly. In response, we redesigned our workshops. Our educators had told us they wanted support in the how to set up their LMS sites rather than the why, but we did move away from an instructional focus to include 101 lesson planning. This is a topic that we were warned our educators did not want, but we could see that this was the key to them developing better LMS sites. So we did it by stealth, using our own lesson plans, like this one on the screen, but filled out for our own workshops as a teaching tool in the workshops. Work through the plan as a bit of an agenda, pointing out the value of the pre-class learning that we'd asked the educators to do and how we were using that as a springboard for the workshop. We made explicit where we were delivering content versus when the educators were participating in an activity, and where they were interacting with content with their peers and with us as the educators. This approach is slowly taking us towards a much more meaningful uptake of our model as we give our educators more time to engage with their learning. I'll hand over to you, Barb, now for the big questions.
Yeah, so this is what we were starting to think, because there wasn't widespread uptake of what we felt was a successful development and made it easier. And we started to think, well, are we doing the devil's work? Are we just trying to impose something that we think is a good idea? And because not everyone thought it was a good idea to have a consistent structure and a consistent layout so that students could navigate their way. We seem to be trying to shoehorn everyone into the same approach and template. The academics didn't really like the uniformity, although there were opportunities for them to express individualisation. The academics also felt that changes were imposed upon them from the faculty, as they were in my faculty in a way, but we, to be honest, didn't have the same success as Joe with rolling things out. But we were imposing, we were trying to shoehorn people into a consistent pedagogic model that was based on learning theory. We also had feedback from students, as Joe did, but the academics didn't seem really bothered by the student experience at all. I was quite shocked. And say, students are saying that Moodle generally is a mess, they can't find stuff, and they go, well, when I was at university. And I started to wonder whether they're a bit nervous about the change, whether they just didn't like change at all. There's also a power dynamic between the academic staff and education designers. That power imbalance is evident, although it's argued by Roxer et al. That our institutions afford us power. And we are funded by the Office of the Deputy Vice Chancellor Education, not the faculty. So we are mandated from, quite high up in the hierarchy, but we don't really have the power to tell people what to do. We can't make them. And as an educator, I have to say, I know that you cannot make people learn. I don't want to make people do things. I would rather build a relationship and persuade them, show by good example and those sorts of things. It's a very fine balance of power. But it comes down to this question: are we destroying the joy and creativity in teaching? Because many of our educators light up when they start lecturing. They love standing and talking about their special subject and their research, and they love bringing students along on that journey. They just don't like the preparation of learning materials that goes around all that so much, and they roll over assessments from year to year. So in a certain light, it could be seen that by having a template that we feel helps people fit into create learning opportunities based on our knowledge of how people learn, we feel that we wonder whether we're removing the agency of the educator and limiting their scope for creativity. And the literature prompts us to ask that question as well. Are we destroying the joy? Is our reliance on context for learning and clear labelling of assessments and scaffolding the learning and constructive alignment? Robert Nelson has written a whole book on the creativity crisis in higher education. I was very moved by it. So we have asked ourselves, have we stifled creativity? And that's something I think we all need to reflect on. I'll hand back to Jo, and she'll talk about what we learned from this process.
So what we learned was that there is a gap between our perceptions of good education practice and the perceptions of our educators. They're not educational researchers, and this is not their area of expertise. We don't have the power to make them do it, nor would we want to do it to them. However, they don't all trust us to guide them towards good practice. Our initial change management strategy was to build relationships, work with early adopters, showcase exemplars of good practice within the faculties, all within the university vision and strategy. Now we must reflect on what we know and understand makes for good learning and apply this theory, knowledge and practical experience to build the capacity of our educators. We need to treat our educators as learners. So how are we doing this? As we examine our change processes, we're changing the strategies we use to facilitate this learning. We looked to Piaget, Vygotsky, Knowles, Biggs, Laurillard, amongst many others. Firstly, to map out the stages of cognitive development, introducing pre-abstract strategies in our workshops, going back to using butcher's paper, post-it notes, big markers, whiteboards, to enable our educators to have hands-on experience, to scaffold the learning towards high abstract cognitive development. The learning is practical and relevant, so educators can construct learning and apply it to their own practice immediately. Our workshops are collegial and dialogic, where teaching teams have space and time to draw on their own experience, discuss and express their doubts with trusted peers, come to an agreement on the purpose of changing their practice, and build their own understanding of what constitutes good practice. We have since recast our change management strategy as a learning design. This strategy has allowed educators the freedom to trial ideas and recast their own failures as part of their learning process. Importantly, over time, many of their educators who felt threatened and rushed have appreciated being in control of their learning and are increasingly developing agency and confidence to adopt new education practices. So while we won't eliminate the inherent tensions in the work, we can recognise them and slow down to make room for the learning to take place. Now that brings us to the end of our presentation, and I'm just slipping over to the poll everywhere to see what kind of responses we have. Barb, would you like to, how are we going for time?
Well, we're out of our time and we're into question time.
Okay, maybe I'll leave that up there and see if that prompts any questions.
Yes, that sounds good.
I have to go and
so
grab
someone,
my
Francis has asked if they can have the title of the Nelson book. Is that one of the references on the last slide in our presentation?
I forgot to put it in, Barb, but I can find it and put it in the chat.
Yes, thank you. I thought I might have had it on my table here, but I don't. It's something like Crisis in Creativity by Robert Nelson. I used to work with Robert Nelson at Monash. He's absolutely an amazing educator. He's so, I could listen to him speak about assessment forever, really, to be honest.
I'll just jump in. Oh,
yes.
sorry. I'll just jump in and say thank you for that presentation. I know, having done learning design for many years, I can understand where you're coming from and how you're looking at going forward and some of the reactions, but also the acknowledgement that actually we need to push forward with this important work. Does anyone else, we have a few minutes to go, and I think we'll try to finish maybe a minute early to allow people time to jump into the next presentation because they are back to back. Does anyone else have any questions?
The thing about my case study, the case study I talked about, is that we gave the educators time, the sort of time that Jo talked about in her last piece. And I think that made the difference because they worked through all their anxiety and their angst and arrived at something they were really happy with. And it was very successfully rolled out. Even with the pandemic, they didn't have the same trouble adapting because they had this structure in place and they were quite confident. But we don't all have the luxury of time. And I often get called in to help out or to advise when units have had consistently poor student evaluation of teaching. And they're, you know, in the red for a couple of years, and then they call me in, and I work with the educators at that point. And I find that at that point, when they've been really criticised and they're, you know, on the mat, so to speak, they also take the time to try some different things and take up some of my suggestions. But we don't always have that time, you understand.
Oh, that's right.
Thanks, Joe. Creativity Crisis. Yeah, that's Robert Nelson's book. Yeah. It's a really lovely book. Really, really. He's an amazing intellectual and writes so beautifully about education. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it.
We do have our slides attached to the to this presentation screen, but we did leave Robert's reference on off the list. But there are some other references on there. But we'll update that and upload it back up there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I was struck by your question about creativity, and I've done a bit of reading. I think it's Woods and Schleicher who talk about good quality education is a balance of informed prescription and informed professionalism, and really allowing academic staff or faculty in North America to have that understanding of policy and best practice, providing that to them so they can be creative in their own practice, and sort of taking away that uncertainty for them, I think is really helpful. But you're absolutely spot on with time and workload. And I think sometimes a misunderstanding of the amount of time it takes to do things, like create new documentation and videos for LMSs and that kind of thing.
But it's the cognitive shift for the academics as well.
Absolutely.
Because they have this frame in mind of how university works from their own experience, which was a long time ago. And certainly, you know, it's a time I think of as well for me, my experience, but it's different now. And our students are different. And that's confusing for them. You know, they say, why aren't they doing the readings? You know, so it is quite hard for them. I do recognise that. And I do worry about the creativity and sort of, I hope, make plenty of allowance for that.